Kieffer. I'm a Facebook engineer on the chat team, and if you need to contact me at any point, I'm Brufa pretty much everywhere, Skype, IRC, Twitter, etc. And I just want to thank you guys for coming here. I know we've got Isaac next door doing the NPM talk, and I actually really like NPM a lot, and kind of wish I was there as well to check that out. So I appreciate your time here. So let me start by sort of giving you a little background on who I am, since I don't know how many of you actually have heard of me. I've been developing web apps for actually quite a while. I started writing rich, like MVC JavaScript applications in the client back in 1998, 1999. And I've been doing that for pretty much my whole career since then. I've at companies like AOL, Google, most recently Facebook, and with a couple of startups in between. So I like to think I've got a pretty good perspective on this whole JavaScript thing. As far as my street cred with Node goes, I've got my fingers on a couple of little things, I would say, like modules that are more micro libraries than anything else. Things like Node MIME, which I guess is used in Express and Connect these days. If you want to do RFC compliant UUID generation, my Node UUID library is the way to go. JS Litmus is an ad hoc benchmarking library I did that was the basis of jsperf.com, and then a little library for doing int64 manipulation in Node Thrift, which Wade Simmons has been putting together. And then within Facebook, I seem to have fallen into the role of internal Node evangelist. So Adam Wolf and I run the Node group that's internal to Facebook, and I'll talk a little bit more about what exactly that means to evangelize within a company. So let me set the background for this a little bit, just to give you guys some context, and maybe to give those of you who are here thinking I'm going to be talking about us deploying thousands of servers in production and all the hard data and stuff that we learned from that opportunity to go head over to Isaac's talk, because the reality is Facebook isn't doing enough with Node right now. We're actually just getting started. But I think what we are doing is pretty interesting, and more importantly, what I really want to talk about today is sort of the Node in the context of a large company like Facebook, where you have to deal with things at a scale that really aren't being done at very many other places around the country, around the world. So what I'm going to talk about today, is, like I said, isn't really going to be nuts and bolts details on how you deploy thousands of Node servers. It's going to be more about why I think Facebook needs Node, why we're not embracing it yet, why we're not that far along the curve, and what I and some of the other folks within the company are doing to change that, and to what extent we're failing or succeeding in that. So why does a company like Facebook need Node? I mean, one of the things that we run into, or that I run into when I talk to people within our company who aren't Node enthusiasts by nature, is sort of this, well, they're not impressed reaction. And a large part of that is, I think, the things that get JavaScript people excited, coming from sort of the client JavaScript community and having access to server-side JavaScript, in the form of, the single-threaded event loop, just don't really turn them on. There's all these alternatives out there, like LiveEV, LiveEvent, Tornado, Event Machine. Those technical problems have been solved in other languages. You can solve them in other languages. And especially at Facebook, where we already have hundreds of millions of users that are being supported on servers by thousands of servers. When you talk to the people that have put that system in place, it's really hard to argue with success. So there is a significant amount of, I think, well-justified resistance there. So it does beg this question of, like, well, where is the value to a really large company that has established itself with technologies that are working? And I guess the answer to that, I've actually been thinking about this a fair bit lately, and the answer to that, I guess I'll have to sort of give you an anecdote from the dark days of the internet when I first started doing JavaScript. And this was a small startup I did back in 1999, 2000, that was started by I and 3 of my friends. And of course, one of those was the CEO who was off doing CEO things. And the 3 of us that left 3 of us to be sort of the engineering side of the company. And what we were doing was building the goal of the company was to build Microsoft Office for the web, so Google Docs, but done with JavaScript DHTML. And our first product was going to be a productivity presentation application. So when we sat down, the 3 of us sort of looked at each other and were like, well, we know we're going to be using JavaScript and DHTML on the client, Apache and Java servlets on the middle layer, and MySQL and SQL on the back end. And we had this discussion of like, okay, well, who's gonna do what? What are the roles we're going to assign? And I ended up drawing the short straw and found myself doing JavaScript. So, that's what I ended up doing for the next 12 years. And sort of the irony at the time was I never thought I was going to put that on my resume because I was sure this whole JavaScript thing was just a passing fad. So it fortunately hasn't turned out that way. The point of this is that on that project, and pretty much every project I've been on, every web-based application effort I've undergone has had this very early conversation where engineers have been cubbyholed into one of those slots. Are you a front-end engineer, a middleware, or are you a back-end database guy? And while that can be a good thing, I mean, after all, it does lead to these conversations between people about, well, okay, you've got Fred on the front end, who needs Maria who's doing the middleware stuff to implement some functionality for her. And that enables this conversation about, well, what should that API look like? To what extent do we need logic in that middle layer versus on the client? And it creates these very well thought out APIs, these very nice and modular and structured interfaces. At the end of the day, it really slows you down. You have to have this conversation. And more importantly, it doesn't allow you to really distribute your resources. And one of the things that from that company that really stuck with me at the time was a period when we were actually in talks with AOL to get acquired, and they came to us on a Monday and said, hey, we really like this technology you've developed and this team, and you're selling us on this whole stack of JavaScript, really interactive applications, but we'd like you to prove that. And what we'd like you to do is build us a web calendar, a prototype, because they had a traditional static calendar application, and it was really sort of slow and laggy, all these page turns. And so they said, yeah, come back a week from now and show us what you've done with this, give us a prototype. And of course, our CEO, being the CEO, immediately turned to us and said, hey, I don't want to give them a prototype, I want to give them a full-blown application. And there ensued this conversation where we sort of all turned to Rob Davis, who was on our back end, and said, hey, what do we need to do this? And he said, well, give me half an hour and I'll implement the schema you need for calendar events in our database. And so, half an hour later, he came back. And then we turned to Keith in the middle layer and was like, well, what do we need to transport this data back and forth between the server and the front end? And Keith was like, well, all I really need to do is whitelist the data types that we're sending. And then they all looked at me and were like, okay, we need a calendar app, and you've got a week. And I ended up spending something like 120 hours over the next week writing all this JavaScript for a full-blown calendar application. And it was incredibly rewarding. I mean, it was an intense period of time. And it worked out really well. AOL loved it, and my wife went to take me to dinner afterwards after we'd given the presentation as sort of a little celebratory thing. And about halfway through dinner, I literally just started shaking, chills, and just completely exhausted. And I was like, honey, we got to go home. And the reason why I'm going down this path is that had we been using Node, had we had JavaScript throughout our whole technology stack, instead of everybody turning to me as the front end guy and saying, hey, you've got to implement this, you're the only one that's got this experience, we could have turned to the whole team and said, hey, I know you guys have been doing JavaScript in the middle layer and back end, but it's the same language, it's the same basic patterns. And you can bring all of that to the front, to the front end development and really make that work for us. And instead of me doing 120 hours, it would have been, 3 of us putting in a normal work week, which would have worked out a lot better and probably produced a better product in the end. So the point being, for me, the real value in Node is not so much the technology side of things, but it's the organizational and the cultural differences and options that it enables. And I think that's often overlooked. At a small startup, you tend to get a lot of cross-discipline expertise anyways. But when you get into larger companies like Facebook, that's definitely less the case. And I think pretty much any project that's got more than 3 people on it has this degree of specialization to some extent. So if there's this benefit, like why isn't Facebook going down this garden path? Why aren't we jumping all over Node? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but the one that really came to mind for me was basically, that saying about a million monkeys and a million typewriters eventually producing the collected works of Shakespeare. At Facebook, we've got 600 million. And not to say our users are monkeys, so please don't tweet that because my boss is in the audience and I'll get a call from HR. But what we do have is just millions of users that do all sorts of inexplicable things. And if you put a new technology in production without thoroughly vetting it, they will discover every bug, every design flaw, every performance weakness that technology has. And the results of that are these guys. They go from being 600 million users to these guys, 600 million monkeys, angry monkeys. And I have these all lined up for a reason because they're organized. And you get things like the whole beacon fiasco and all this hubbub over privacy issues, not to dismiss that because that's very important. But it's just no fun. And so that's where a lot of the resistance to Node comes from in large organizations. But that's also very hand-wavy. So let me go into a little bit more detail on what that means. At Facebook, performance is a top-tier priority in ways that are really surprising to me. I've actually only been at the company since July, which, by the way, makes me more senior than like 44% of the company. It's bizarre. So one of the things that you find when you join Facebook is there is an intense focus on performance and CPU usage in particular. If you can come in and you can reduce average CPU usage on our web tier machines by 1%, you will be a frickin' rock star. At the next engineering all hands, our VP of engineering will literally point you out in the audience, ask you to stand up, put your picture up on the screen and say, this person is saving us millions of dollars. It's that noteworthy, 1%. We've also developed our own proprietary, well, not proprietary, that's actually open source, web server called Hip Hop, which compiles PHP into native code because of this issue. Similarly, reliability. You need a system that's gonna be bomb-proof day in and day out, or at least have well understood failure characteristics. And both of these things, I think the reality with Node is right now is that for a company like Facebook or Google or Yahoo, there's really nobody for us to look around at and say, oh, those guys have done it. These issues are understood. And that's really scary. And so this issue is certainly foremost in the conversations I have with people. And then there's some other secondary issues not related directly to the production performance. Things like code inertia. Facebook has 8 million lines of PHP. And that represents an incredible investment of intellectual capital. And just as an aside, we have about 300,000 lines of JavaScript, and the chat team has about 12,000 lines of Erlang that the chat system runs. So for people who care about that sort of thing. There's also things like deployment processes and tools. At a company like Facebook, where you have thousands of web servers in production, rolling these things out is a non-trivial task. And you need a lot of tools to help you do that. And a lot of people put a lot of effort into that. And of course, any new technology makes that sort of rocks the boat in that regard. And so your ops team, your weekly push team that's responsible for these things, they're going to look at you with a really wary eye. And then finally, we have Devtools. So actually, Facebook just open sourced a product called Fabricator, which is the internal tool we use for browsing our resource repository and doing code reviews. You may want to check that out. It's actually pretty cool. I'm pretty impressed by how well that works. So I think that's sort of the litany of issues at the cultural level that we run into when talking about Node with people inside the company. So how do we get across this chasm? How do we actually get people inside the company to embrace this new technology that's got a lot of sort of unknown performance characteristics at Facebook scale? So what I and the other folks are within the company who are familiar with Node and enthusiastic about it are doing is we started out with an internal group, which is basically a mailing list. There's nothing too revolutionary about that. And that gives you some obvious benefits, like it allows you to coordinate the people who are passionate about Node already for whatever reason. We have about 60 people in the group. We share links to new updates, new modules, various information that is pertinent to the sort of things we're doing. It also lets you educate people who haven't heard about Node or just curious about it. They have a record of the discussion that's gone on before they found out about it. It gives them a way to discover events. So we actually bring in people to talk about Node. We've had Ryan and Matt Rainey talk, and that's been really well received. And I think it's done a lot to really raise the awareness. And then the really surprising benefit for me came in a lunch conversation that I was having with some folks that were in the Node group. And we were talking about Node and sort of how we could get things, moving inside Facebook. And a guy named Ben Maurer, who's one of the founders of reCAPTCHA, the CAPTCHA technology that you see around the web a lot, kept pushing back and in ways that I found kind of negative, and it was very disconcerting. And I eventually called him out on it. I was like, dude, why are if you're this down on Node, like why are you down on it in the first place? And furthermore, why are you even in this group? And his response was essentially, well, I want to make sure you guys don't do anything stupid. And I really don't think it's a good idea for Facebook to be embracing more technologies. In fact, as a matter of fact, we should be using less. And so he came from the camp of simplicity being a really important priority and a really good way of minimizing the overhead involved in running all the systems that Facebook runs. And it took me a while to come around to this point of view, and I actually agree with him. In general, you do want to have as few technologies as possible at a company. I just happen to think Node should be one of those. So after thinking about this for a while, I realized that he's actually doing an incredibly valuable service for us, in that he is keeping an eye on us and making sure we don't screw up prematurely and really alienate ourselves by doing something that's going to permanently get people resistant to the idea of Node. So, embrace your critics. They're your best friends. And then in actual practical terms, in terms of what we're doing with Node, we're trying to use it everywhere we can that doesn't put us in critical spots right now. So, and ideally we're doing that in places that allow us to touch the critical systems. So let me talk a little bit about what that means in practical terms. This is sort of the menu of what we're doing right now. And one of the advantages of having that Node group is it lets us get a pretty good idea of who's doing what with Node inside Facebook. And so here's the menu. To start off with, I don't know how many people have heard of JS Game Bench. Actually, if you could raise your hands, like who knows what JS Game Bench is? Okay. So JS Game Bench is a JavaScript benchmarking suite for HTML5 technologies related to game development. It's put together by a guy named Corey Andreka and Bruce. Adam, do you remember Bruce's last name? Bruce Rogers. And it's actually pretty cool because what they're doing is bringing, in much the way like SunSpider tests have brought attention to JavaScript performance, they're bringing attention to WebGL performance, CSS animations, and various other technologies that game developers are likely to use. That's open source, and it comes with a Node server that you can use to run the tests and the benchmarks. We have a mobile JavaScript framework under development that we'll be announcing. I don't actually know when we'll be announcing it, but the intent is to open source that. That uses Node for both a test server and also as a build tool. So in those cases, I would say there's nothing too extraordinary about those. They are fairly small projects. The bulk of our Node work is actually being done on the chat team. And I think that's something that it's something that we sort of brought to the table as mostly just because it gave us an opportunity to explore the performance characteristics of Node. So what we're using it for is doing traffic analysis of our production chat system. So we actually set up port replication, and we'll pull TCP traffic, pull out a TCP dump over the course of an hour or so, and run that data through Node and use the Node PCAP library to analyze and get a performance, or rather a traffic profile of the HTTP and thrift traffic. And then we actually use that and feed that information into our load testing system that we use to actually test these production systems. And the cool thing about this is that because we're using Node alongside this production data, it actually gives us a pretty good data point for how Node will perform in production. And unfortunately, I don't really have hard numbers I can give you folks because we've been pretty heads down on just trying to get this stuff working, and I don't know that we have a good enough feel for what these performance characteristics really are yet to go public with those. But that certainly would be our intent. I can hand wave around things like, for example, that hour's worth of traffic data. We run that through Node in about 10 minutes, a single Node process. So, for example, we do know that if we put Node in production as a monitoring and analysis system, we shouldn't have any problem there performance-wise. It should be able to handle the traffic we throw at it as far as bandwidth and CPU required there. And then the last thing that we're doing on the chat team, and this is more just my own efforts, is we're using it for what I call production hacking. So I've actually found it to be really useful to set up a Node proxy server that alters the behavior of our production system in a way that I can still use to test with the front-end client. So for example, I'm in the process of adding support for XHR and cores, which require various origin-related headers in the HTTP packet. And rather than going in and mucking around in the Erlang system and setting up my own tier of back-end chat servers and then figuring out how to reconfigure everything so that my account points to that, I instead just set up tell Firefox to point at my little Node proxy, which I've set up to actually modify those headers on the fly in both directions. And I can actually add XHR cores support to our production system on my local box. It's a pretty cool trick. I highly recommend it. I've done stuff like that in a couple cases. And then the last thing we've done is just enhance our internal tool chain for deploying systems to actually support Node and NPM. So that's pretty much the presentation. There's a saying at Facebook that we're 1% done, and you see little stickers all over the place. This chair is 1% done, this food is 1% done, this toilet's 1% flushed. It's very cheesy, but I actually think it's what it gets at in what that gets at in the underlying statement is really that it's a journey, and in this case, we're not doing as much with Node as I think we'd like to be doing. We're 1% of the way, but I'm hopeful that in a year's time when we come back, that I'll have hard data on what our performance is, that I'll be able to tell you guys, yeah, Facebook is running 1,000 Node servers in production, and it's saved us this much CPU, and and our bandwidth, our costs are down by X number of dollars. But I'll also still finish with this slide that says we're 1% done, because I'm sure at that time, the capabilities of Node and the landscape of the Node community will be that much larger. So that's it, if you have any questions. The question is, what do the Erlang guys think of Node? That's actually a good question, because the short answer is they actually like the Erlang system. They think it's perfectly capable of handling the traffic of what we have today. And I'm inclined, it seems to be working. The flip side of that is the airline guys that originally wrote the chat system are pretty burned down on it and have gone on to other projects and have left us in some way, I won't say this too, with too much resentment, but we've been kind of left holding the bag, and trying to find good Erlang developers is a real challenge. And I think it gets back to that point I made about having a single technology throughout your up and down your stack actually gives you a lot more options. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting conversation to get into the details of how Erlang and Node compare. So, anything else?
The question is, I was wondering how that test stuff works. Is it just the exit status of the project?
All right, thank you.